Okay, we're going to talk about the Senate in terms of making laws. Very, very important. The House being the first, usually the first stop, and then the Senate usually being the second stop. Although sometimes bills can also be initiated in the Senate as well. So, anyways, this is 12.4 guided reading. This looking at focusing on how the Senate differs from the House of Representatives in terms of making laws. So they one way that they differ is only one calendar for all bills reported out of its committees. The House has a traffic cop, the Rules Committee. The Senate has one calendar, a little smaller body, so easier to manage, right? 425 versus um, uh, 435 versus 100, so it makes it a little bit easier to manage. So only one calendar for all the bills reported out of committees. They're called to the Senate floor by the majority leader. So in the House, you've got the Speaker and the Rules Committee that runs the ship, that controls the flow of legislation. In the Senate, it's the majority leader. So that's the biggest difference. Debate isn't timed. There's no rules set aside like for the Rules Committee or the Speaker. It's almost unrestrained. You can speak as long as you please. And you've got this idea of a unanimous consent agreement that if no senator objects, usually what you have then is some rules placed in the limit of the amount of floor time or that will be devoted to a measure or amendments to the bill. So usually what will happen is you will have some rules laid out to it if all the senators agree. Whereas in the House, it doesn't matter if they agree. There's going to be invocation of the idea that with that many members, 435 members, there's going to be certain rules that the Senate's a little bit more informal in that sense. So they come to unanimous consent. They'll agree to rules on particular measures. They have, for example, have a formal two-speech rule that you can't speak more than twice on the floor on any given question on the same legislative day. So the biggest difference with the Senate is they have this idea of this tool called a filibuster, which is largely increased over time because of some rule changes in the night after the civil rights legislation in the 1960s. There's quite a few filibusters in the 1960s to try to stop a civil rights legislation. However, what the filibuster ended up doing was that it ended up, because they couldn't get a cloture vote or 16 senators to submit a petition to vote a 60 vote supermajority on the motion. That's what according to Senate rules is needed to end a filibuster. But what happened was that it would stop all the legislation altogether. So it would halt the Senate to a complete halt. They changed some of the rules in the 1970s so that so there's two tracks. You can filibuster on the legislation in question, but still have other Senate business going on. But again, the purpose of it is to delay or prevent Senate action on a measure. That's the purpose. And by a cloture vote, 60 votes, with 16 senators submitting a petition, they could stop a filibuster. So again, you have to get 60 senators to agree. There's not always 60 senators that are Democrats or Republicans. Right now, we're 51-49. So it protects the minority and prevents hasty and ill-considered legislation. But it can, as I mentioned, promote gridlock or some even public ridicule. So like I said, in the 1960s, in the 50s, I mean, they were filibustering. There were some filibusters of legislation that would have that held the Senate in gridlock. so they kind of ended that idea, and now you can consider other legislation along with the filibuster legislation. But the idea of a filibuster is that the Senate or group of senators has to continuously speak on the floor and hold the floor. So sometimes you get ridiculous speeches, you get long-winded speeches, but they must continuously hold the floor with a speech, them or members of their party. So filibusters have become more common because, I guess I was talking about, the cloture rule is such that 60 is the minimum number of votes necessary to pass an important bill in the Senate, and not 51. Because it's so party control has been pretty narrow. A 60 vote majority for any party has not been held in the last 10, 15 years. So it's become more common. There's also been some rule changes that have made it more common. However, recently, it's now just for legislation that the filibusters will work. They changed the rules for judicial nominations under Trump, and to get some of his party members, some of his cabinet members passed. So they changed the process for nominations. Now cloture votes only 51, a simple majority for nominations, but not legislation. Remember, the Senate confirms the nomination of all judicial appointments, not just Supreme Court, but all federal judicial appointments, um, and the cabinet and other executive positions. So if the House and Senate pass different versions of the same bill, the House usually first concurs in the first House concurs in the other amendments, and the congressional action is completed. However, if the House or Senate will not accept the other version of the bill, we have another type of committee called the conference committee to iron out the differences and come up with a compromise bill. So that's comprised of both the Senate and House members. So conference committees sometimes, again, are the third house of Congress. A number of major legislative decisions and compromises are often made by conference committees. So really, usually, only rarely does that either house turn down a conference committee's work. Usually, conference committees iron out the differences, make compromises, and so on. So the president. So let's say we pass the bill in the House, pass the bill in the Senate. It's ready to go to the president. President has different options. He can sign the bill, veto the bill, allow the bill to become law without signing it, not acting on it within 10 days, or use what's called a pocket veto. Allow the measure to die by not acting on it within 10 days when Congress has adjourned its session. So if Congress adjourns, and its session, and usually this can happen around the holidays or the summer or something like that, the Congress will adjourn, and the president won't act on it within 10 days, then it's essentially a pocket veto. Again, vetoes don't happen too often anymore, because what happens is they know that the president is going to veto, and it's part of our systems of checks and balances. So because the president has this power, they know that if the president vetoes, they have to have a 2/3 majority to override, and if they don't have that, then they're not going to be able to pass the legislation. So the president is a player in the legislative process, essentially. So that gives us a little idea of how the Senate is a little bit different from the House of Representatives. Smaller body, 100 versus 435, so a little bit of different rules that come into play.